Hi, everyone. I was once told to never stand in between an audience and their lunch, so apologies for that. I got to be the lucky one today. My name is Sarah, and I'm going to be talking about working on the front lines of privacy and security with vulnerable populations. And I'm going to start with a small story. In 2016, post-elections, there was a lot of conversations around privacy and security and protecting yourself. And I'm based in New York, and there was definitely a big conversation in New York about what it means for New York to be a sanctuary city for folks. And I was invited then, post-elections in 2016, I was invited to provide translation support for a group of software engineers, security engineers, that were giving a security talk or a security workshop for Yemeni refugees in New York. And I was not invited because of my privacy expertise or my security expertise or my community expertise. I was invited specifically because I spoke Arabic and they needed translation support. I said yes. I went. The security engineers were giving the security workshop, essentially talked about passwords, about security, about privacy, all of that. And they walked out of this workshop essentially saying, it was great. No one had any questions. Nice pat on the back. And I'm going to leave you with the story here for now, and I'll circle back to it later, but that was essentially the context of this very entertaining security workshop in 2016. So a bit of background about who I am. I was here last year at Enigma, and a lot of people asked me what I did, and it always led to very interesting conversations because I have kind of a weird, eclectic background, or the work that I do is not very familiar, I guess, to a lot of people. And this is essentially what inspired this talk that you're hearing today. Very briefly, I guess, when people ask me what I do, I'm a security expert who works for the benefit of civil society, nonprofits, journalists, and human rights defenders. What it means is that I've worked for many years with highly vulnerable populations, highly targeted groups specifically, and my work has taken me everywhere in the world. I've worked in South America, I've worked in East Asia, in the Middle East, in the US. I've worked in high-risk environments, such as the revolution in Iran, such as the conflict in Ukraine, in Myanmar, and I've provided a lot of security expertise or advice on things such as protecting your data and your information, on internet shutdowns and what it means to operate in the context of an internet shutdown, how to use circumvention technology, what works in what context, what works in another context. And most recently, I was the CTO and VP of security at the Open Technology Fund, which not a lot of people know about, but actually is an organization that funds projects and technologies based on countering censorship and surveillance. They were the early funders of Signal. They're kind of like what kicked Signal off the ground. They're one of the main funders of Tor, and a lot of other kind of privacy and security, either applications or research that you might have heard about. I led the organization's efforts to identify and track emerging threats, and to essentially advance the field of information security for journalists, human rights defenders, and high-risk individuals. When people ask me what I do, basically, this is usually the little bit of background that I give, or I say, essentially, I am in the business of giving advice with very serious consequences. Why is it so serious? There is a real danger with security guides and even trainers who tend to focus on a one-size-fits-all approach, and we kind of heard from my colleagues earlier about this, but there is a real danger in focusing on a one-size-fits-all approach, which at best is pretty ignorant and at worst actually quite dangerous and can really have an impact on people's lives. A lot of security researchers or security engineers or experts are not always the best teachers for a number of reasons, but one of the main ones is about context and lacking context or not having enough context about the situation that you're in. So we all know the trope, use Signal, use Tor, we can apply it in any situation supposedly. But for a long time, living in the Middle East, it was actually really difficult to use Signal. You could be in any sort of situation, gathering, and you're sending a Signal message to someone. You have no idea if they're receiving it. You have no idea if it's sent. There was just a lot of high latency, and it was very hard to rely on Signal. And that was the advice that was being given, especially in the context of a protest. And sometimes it goes beyond latency. Sometimes Signal is actually kind of banned or its use is criminalized. If someone stops you and sees signal on your phone, that can get you into serious trouble. So a lot of applications are developed and tested in the US, in Europe, in the West generally. But when it comes down to having to use it on the ground in different regions, sometimes that can be incredibly dangerous or incredibly challenging, especially for vulnerable populations. So for the context of this talk, when I mention vulnerable populations, I'm talking about this specific group of people. I'm talking about human rights defenders, about journalists, about activists, about organizers. Vulnerable populations can encompass a lot more, but those are the folks that I have experience working with, and this is basically what I'm talking about and what I'm referring to. And security is very hard for these folks for a number of reasons. A lot of them work independently. They're independent journalists, they're freelancers. They lack the protection of a bigger organization, which at times can have certain security practices or better security practices. But here the responsibility, the onus of the responsibility is on the individual itself. So security is hard because of that. You are essentially holding the entire responsibility of your own security. If the person actually belongs to a larger organization, more often than not, these organizations are severely under-resourced, either from a personnel perspective or financially. And that really prevents them from investing in their privacy and security standing. And then finally, security is hard because really of digital security literacy. It is hard to recognize attacks, and it is even harder to understand how to protect yourself against these attacks. There's not enough information, and that essentially makes it very difficult. And the stakes are very high. Very often, and you've again heard it from the previous two talks, the stakes are high because digital attacks very often are intersect with real-world physical violence. What you see on the screen is a project from this group called Forensic Architecture, which is a research group based out of the University of London, who they use basically architectural techniques and technologies to investigate cases of human rights abuses in the world. And they worked on this project in 2021, which shows essentially patterns of incidents between the physical and digital sphere. The physical is in red, the digital is in blue. And they essentially shows how infections of spyware, in this case Pegasus from NSO Group, how infections from spyware essentially are entangled with real-world violence and extend in the professional and the personal spheres and networks of the folks who were targeted. In this case, again, we're talking about journalists, organizers, human rights activists, and all. And the field is very complicated, and that's part of why it's hard to talk about security and human rights, because it really, I mean, there's so many different areas of expertise. You could be talking or working on internet shutdowns, you could be working on state surveillance, you could be working on social media and online identity, on organizational security, on reverse engineering phones of people who have been targeted and who have been hacked by nation-state actors. You could be talking about travel security and what it means to cross a border with sensitive information, what it means to enter a different country. Really, there's a lot of different categories here, and they all kind of intersect together if you're doing this type of work. So to illustrate it a little bit, I'm going to walk through about 4 examples of what essentially a day in the life of someone like myself who works at this intersection of security and human rights, or privacy and human rights. What are some of the types of challenges that come up? So the first example that I have is out of Egypt. I was working with a group of folks who were actually coming into the country and trying to understand the situation there and how to essentially cross into the country, how to navigate just being around Cairo. In Egypt, one of the big concerns is around device seizure. You could be walking down the street in Cairo, you will be stopped by the police. The police will ask to see your phone and will go through your phone. And then if you have certain apps on your phone that are kind of deemed suspicious, like if you have Signal, or if you have a VPN, or if you have Tor, or if you have an LGBT dating app, that could immediately mean that you'll be taken into interrogation, taken into really spending like a few days in jail, and being questioned about why you have this application on your phone. However, in the context of Egypt, what's interesting is that also not having certain apps is deemed kind of suspicious. So if you do not have Facebook, if you kind of entered the situation telling yourself, you know what, I'm going to delete Facebook from my phone, I'm going to sanitize my device a bit, that way I will be protecting my information or my privacy. If you do not have Facebook on your phone, that is also deemed suspicious in the context of Egypt, because who wouldn't have Facebook on their phone in Egypt? Everyone has Facebook on their phone in Egypt. So having sometimes a device that is way too sanitized can get you in trouble or can raise suspicions. And that doesn't only apply for the Egypt context, that also applies in situations of domestic violence, for example, where if your device is too sanitized and you've deleted things like your search history, that could also kind of raise suspicions from an abusive partner. The second example I have is from Lebanon. In 2019, Lebanon had a revolution. I'm Lebanese, I grew up there, I spent the majority of my life there. I was there in 2019 at the beginning of the revolution, and I spent a lot of time working with activists and journalists on the ground on securing their devices, on protecting themselves, on understanding the capabilities of the government and what they could surveil, what they could intercept, what they could see, what they couldn't. And I spent a lot of time there doing this, and came back to the US. COVID happened, mid-2020, the George Floyd protests started happening. Myself and a few other activists from Lebanon very quickly in that first week essentially put together a guide, a security guide for protests. And it went quite viral, which we were not expecting. But what we did is essentially borrow a lot of advice that we had learned in Lebanon, that we had borrowed ourselves from Chile, from Hong Kong, from things that happen on the ground there. And we put all this together essentially in a guide that we shared for protesters and demonstrators in the US. More recently, in the context of Myanmar and Ukraine, I was asked to provide security advice, security and privacy advice on satellite communication for journalists. What are the security implications of it? What are the privacy implications of it? What does it mean to use satellite communication? What does it mean to get data in and out of the country, especially in the context of an internet shutdown, especially in the context of having to deal with the capabilities of the Russian government? Can they triangulate my location? Can they find out where I am? Can I communicate safely with my colleagues? Can I get this information out of the country? What are the real implications, basically, that my use of satellite equipment will have on my personal safety and on the safety of my colleagues? And then my final example here is from Afghanistan. A couple of years ago, I was asked to provide, essentially, or to work with an organization, a human rights organization in Afghanistan, on essentially kind of bolstering their security, organizational security stance. And I kind of went into this having some assumptions, at least about the way that their IT setup was. I assumed that everyone had a computer. I assumed that everyone had an email address, or there were some accounts to deal with. And very quickly, actually, I learned that about 5 employees were sharing one device. I learned that all these devices were actually quite old and hadn't been updated in a very long time and were barely working. A lot of these devices had very questionable software, as in pirated versions of Microsoft Word with a lot of vulnerabilities. And in this case, this organization had received a security training from folks who had come from the US, given a security training for 2 days, and giving them advice such as Google is dangerous, like Google will steal your information, don't use this, don't use that. Actually, let's set you up on alternate services. We're going to set up an email account here, we're going to set up like a data account here. And what ended up happening is that they did all of this in about 2 days. Everyone eventually got locked out of their accounts. They couldn't really reset passwords because it would lead them to a different email that they did not have access to anymore. They couldn't have access to their data and to the research. I mean, it was just a mess, like everything. They were just locked out of accounts and all of that, because essentially of this kind of parachuting in type of advice, where security experts essentially had come into the situation, given them a certain type of advice, changed everything in about 2 days, and then walked out of the situation. So those are some of the challenges and some of the, I mean, really, like a day in the life of a security researcher who works with vulnerable populations, who works on human rights cases. If this seems interesting to you and you're like, yes, you know what, like I want to be doing something like this, like I want to be aligned with the work that I do, what does it take to be a public interest technologist? Like how do you build a career in this field? And this is a lot of the questions that I had gotten last year when I was talking about the work that I did. So there's not really one path into this work because of a number of different reasons. It's pretty challenging and sometimes impossible to think about how to get into this type of work because there is a lack of consistency, there's a lack of structure, there are not a lot of opportunities. You can't easily go to a job database and find security, human rights, or security technologist, public interest technologist. But there is a network of people that do this work. Like there is a global network, a community of cybersecurity professionals who basically like their entire job is to protect and safeguard freedom, human rights. They're kind of like a cyber justice league that works for the benefit of civil society and for the benefit of human rights. They work to protect vulnerable populations. And there's a lot of people at the front line of this work. I've been in this work for about a decade. And I remember when I came into it through the human rights angle. And when I started doing it, I remember the field was so small. I mean, we all knew each other. We'd show up at a conference. We were a handful of people, 100, 200. Right now, we're talking about 1,000 plus colleagues that I can see and recognize when I go to these conferences. So I've definitely seen this field evolve, and it's become a lot more obvious today, the intersection of technology and human rights, or the intersection, or understanding how technology has a very real and serious impact on people's lives and on human rights. There are a lot of ways to get involved in this work. There are a lot of conferences, essentially, that you can attend where you get to meet really like everyone kind of working on different aspects and different sides of this issue. You get to meet technologists, you get to meet security experts, you get to meet the activists that are on the front lines of this work, you get to meet technologists, human rights, all the lawyers who are doing this work as well, really kind of like everyone that's part of this community. And you get to learn from them, really like take the time to connect with experts, take the time to talk to these people and to sit in on things that you might assume that you already know. Like someone is giving a security workshop, I'm a security professional, like I know this, I don't need to sit there, but you will learn something because it's so context specific. There are a lot of fellowships as well. There are a lot of funding opportunities. OTF, for instance, the organization I used to work for, supports research and application development under the umbrella of internet freedom. From last year at Enigma, essentially I connected with a lot of people who eventually applied for funding at OTF, which was really wonderful to see. And there are a lot of organizations that also do this work. So back to my story. We got the tech bros, we got the Yemeni refugees, but essentially as the security engineers walked out, I stayed with the folks in the room and we got to speak. We got to speak in Arabic. And eventually the entire, as you probably expected, the entire security workshop kind of went over their heads. Most of these people did not even have email addresses. They were sharing one device, like one phone for the entire family. And really their main worry was about human trafficking. They had just gotten to the US. They were trying to understand how to navigate the job market and how to not enter like essentially a scheme of human trafficking. And so talking about email, 2FA, password management, that was really completely irrelevant for this group. And it doesn't mean that these two planets can never intersect. It just means that there is work to be done. And that work looks like a lot of different things, right? One is really be humble. There's a lot that you don't know, and this is where you should start. Even for me, being Lebanese, when I was in that context in 2019, in the middle of the revolution, I spent time talking to activists there and to journalists there to understand the context that I had essentially missed in the years of being in the US. What was new? What was different? What do I need to know? How do I work with you? How do I co-design with you? Security advice, basically, that fits the context that you are in. I still ask questions. Like I said, attend workshops led by the community. Even if you think you know, I've sat in on so many workshops talking about two-factor authentication and password management, but I will still do it because I will always learn something new from the questions that arise from this very specific context of the people that we're working with. The importance of harm reduction. It's very, very crucial to meet people where they are and to understand the context, again, that they're working in. Telling folks to just not use Facebook doesn't make a lot of sense, because in a lot of places in the world, Facebook is equivalent to the internet. This is how people communicate. So telling them to not use it doesn't really make any sense and really could harm them. Instead, how can you use it differently? How can you use it in a way that feels safer or that protects your privacy a little bit more? And always question your assumptions. Like the Afghanistan example, I went in thinking there was at least a basic semi-functioning IT setup, quickly proven wrong. Question your assumptions, ask questions. And then finally, design from the margins. I'm borrowing this term or this expression from a colleague of mine named Aoun, who's a researcher at an organization called Article 19, who basically the idea is that when you're building tools, you need to center and design for the most high-risk users. Technology is never neutral. The way that we make it, the way that we conceptualize it, the way that we imagine where it fits in our culture, the problems that it's going to solve, these are all design choices that have a deep impact on society. And very often people build tools for other people who kind of look like them, and it doesn't really account for the needs of folks who have been historically marginalized and targeted. So as you're building tools, if this is your job and this is what you do, always ask yourself, like, what is the worst case that can happen? Like, what is the worst thing that could happen in this situation or in a different context? And we've seen it again, this point has been driven home, I think, by my colleagues as well. And plan for those cases. Try to plan for those cases as much as possible. In the Egypt example, again, we're talking about device seizure. A very interesting case, actually, that the same colleague, Aoun, worked on is when your phone is confiscated, if the police were to find Grindr on your phone, and Grindr is an LGBT dating app. If they find Grindr on your phone, that means that they will take you to jail immediately. What does it mean to design the application icon differently to make it look maybe like a calculator or like a notepad, so that when you are in a situation in which your device is seized, then it doesn't look like you have an LGBT dating app on your phone. These are changes actually that Grindr has implemented after feedback from these researchers, which was a really interesting case, and I'm happy to share that research with folks afterwards. I'm going to leave you with this very, very wise quote. The more we learn, the more we discover how much we do not know. Said by none other than Yoda. Thank you, Yoda, for your wisdom. And with that, we got a few minutes for questions and then lunch. And this is where you can find me, here and outside.